We'll start our monthly webinar session today. The topic today is Lean Startup. This is a popular topic and very relevant for our audience of small to mid-sized venture-backed software companies. And most of you, I'm assuming, are generally familiar with the notion. The idea of Lean Startup is how to really build the right thing by incorporating real market feedback by in the process itself. And today we'll cover the basics of Lean Startup and then applying it in the bigger context of an enterprise, how to apply the basic principles. And I'm delighted to have presenter Brian Bozzuto to cover this material with us. I'll introduce Brian in a minute, but let me just quickly go over the basic structure for today's session. We'll have roughly 45 minutes or so of the session here that Brian will cover, and then we'll leave another 10-15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. If you have any questions on the content, you're welcome to keep posting those questions in the Q&A panel, and I'll keep filtering the questions, those that need to be taken with the flow. I'll bring it up along the way for Brian to answer, and then others will reserve them to pick him up at the end. Okay. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll be recording this session in any case, and we'll make the recording as well as the document available to the people who registered and attended in a day or two. So with that, let me introduce Brian. Brian Bozzuto is the principal coach for Big Visible. He's a passionate advocate for continual learning and improvement for individuals, teams, and organizations, and has a background working for large corporations. So he's really good at being able to communicate and coach at different levels of the organization. And besides being conversant and an expert on Lean Startup topic, he has experience using numerous agile techniques, including Scrum, XP, Kanban, and so on. With that, let me turn it over to Brian to go over the Lean Startup topic for us today.
Thanks, Raman, for the introduction. So glad to have everyone on the webinar today. Just to kind of set your expectations and give you guys a little better understanding of my background, I do want to make sure I'm kind of clear. So my background, my experience has really been working with large organizations. And what I want to talk about today is taking a lot of those experiences and lessons learned from the startup community, of which I've worked on only I guess one, maybe two startups if you consider Big Visible. Most of my experience has been working with big companies and taking a lot of these practices and trying to make them work in big companies, which I think is roughly the demographics of a lot of the people we have on. And I'd like to talk about kind of what it is that made Lean Startup unique and why I think it's valuable for larger organizations, and some ways that you can start to apply some of that within the context of your organization. So hopefully that sounds good to you guys, and with that, I guess we'll get going. So I think when we start talking about startups and we start talking about the expectations of what people think they're going to get from it or its history, it's important to kind of start with the mythology or the past experience, that which is in the lore, that which people remember, because there are a handful of startups back in the day where we saw massive breakthroughs at a particular point in time. The two examples I particularly like are Dell and Apple, where you can see Dell was started with about $300,000 in seed money, and then just over 30 years later, is a $24 billion company. Apple, not even as much, and clearly worth even more. I know that price might not quite be right because the stock has moved a bit recently, but we get the idea of this mental model of someone comes out with a wonderful idea, it's innovative, it's breakthrough, and all of a sudden billions of dollars. And I think, unfortunately, that misleads us, right? Because when we think about startups, when we think about some of these innovative breakthrough things, we actually don't see the full data set. We know about Dell and we know about Apple, but we don't know about the hundreds or thousands of other companies that tried similar things and failed. We don't know about them because they never became multi-billion-dollar companies, and they never entered our common knowledge. So I think, unfortunately, when we look at what happened, certainly in the tech boom, was that we had this mental model that these were the nature of businesses, and it was just a matter of kind of getting the right idea and getting enough money behind it. And in late 90s, early 2000s, I think we large corporations actually did get involved in this, and big money got involved in this, and it went really, really bad. Some interesting examples would be, Webvan, where you can see was, received almost 400 million in capital, and it couldn't stay in business for basically more than 2 years. They didn't really understand the nature of the grocery business and how low margin it was, and were building billion-dollar facilities. They never had the sales to support it. Pets.com, another similar one where their whole goal was, if we just get the market share, we'll be worth it. One of my favorite things with that one was one of their promotions. They would do they wanted to do free shipping, but they didn't really think through the idea of one of their big products was cat litter, and how expensive that would be. Ironically, with Pets.com, when that company did go to auction, one of the most valuable assets it had was the sock puppet you see there. Or Cosmo, another one where they did free delivery for anything, so you could buy a stick of gum and they deliver it to you. A similar thing where we see these companies getting massive amounts of money and flaming out very, very quickly, right? So here, if we kind of look back at exactly what's happening in the stock market, we can see massive inflows, huge valuations, and then it all went away. And an interesting thing happened then that I think was in some ways good to the startup community, because a lot of these founders, a lot of these people who wanted to be innovative and wanted to start companies, they no longer had that much money. They could only survive if they could sell a product all the time. It put them under great duress, but what a lot of research has shown, it's real innovation really only happens when you are under that duress. And it does because it forces you to do new things. And this is where we hear this term lean come in. So most people know lean comes from Toyota, where Toyota embarked on a transformational quality initiative focused on eliminating waste. And one of the big forms of waste that they honed in on was basically inventory and capital. That inventory, work in process, is waste. And that a plant that has massive investments in that sort of thing is waste. Now, what most people don't appreciate is it's not so much that Toyota saw the American model, said the American model doesn't work, and came up with this newer idea, as Toyota, coming out of Japan after World War II, couldn't afford the American model. They couldn't afford to build the big factory like the Americans do. They couldn't afford to maintain the massive lines, the massive inventories. They had to get by with less. Consequently, they came up with a more innovative manufacturing process that was actually superior to what the Americans did, which is why if you look in almost any factory today, you will see practices of lean manufacturing there. And on the startup side, something similar happened. And what happened with the startups was that they figured out how to get really good at understanding what their customers want and getting something very small to them very, very quickly. If you think about it, if you're a company that has to operate under cash flow, and you are a startup, that means you can only really keep going if you're selling something to your customers all the time. The nice thing about that is it gives you very good feedback on what your customers really want. So Eric Ries, who coined the term lean startup, will talk about the idea of the goal of a startup, and his point is the startup's goal is to figure out the right thing to build. More than anything else, right? It doesn't matter how operationally efficient you are, if you're building something nobody wants, that's waste, even if you're building it really, really well. And lean startup, and what a lot of these companies have done, is they've gotten really good at figuring out how to methodically build, learn from their customers, and revise what they're building so that they can build ultimately what their customers want. If you think for a moment about agile and perhaps even lean software development and Scrum and all these things, a lot of them help us figure out how to build well, right? In small pieces that are iterative and incremental with collaborative teams, driven by tests, preferably with a lot of automation. That will help us build well. What lean startup is really about is understanding that we're building the right thing. So I'm not going to explain to you guys Agile. I kind of am inferring that a lot of you are already familiar with the basics of it, and you have most likely seen a diagram that looks kind of like what I've got on the screen now, which is probably either like a Scrum or XP-ish type implementation, if you will, right? Where we have, kind of our 3 cycles that most people would be familiar with, right? Our kind of our product owner Our business sponsor puts things into the backlog. The team then plans it in a sprint or iteration. That plan then goes into a 2 to 4 week sprint where they build, they design, build, and test. Every day, the team checks in on progress in the daily stand-up or daily scrum. At the end of the sprint, we have working product. And if you kind of read the Scrum guide, you'll say, well, then we take that working product and we're going to demo it. And from what we learn, then we figure out what to build next. Perfect. Wonderful. The challenge here is this very big assumption. And the very big assumption is that little guy with the list on the lower left knows what he or she wants, right? And sometimes you might have heard some of these terms to describe your product owners. The single ringable neck, the voice of the customer, the decider, that they're responsible for ROI. They're supposed to answer all requirements. They're always supposed to tell the team what to do next, right? If you read a lot of agile text, especially older ones, will be like, go to the product owner. The product owner will tell you what they want, what's most valuable. But it's based on this assumption that your product owner knows what they want. And frequently they don't. And it's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're incompetent. It's because chances are, if you're in a competitive marketplace and you're trying to define a breakthrough, innovative product, you don't know what you want. By definition, if it's innovative, it's not what's already been done. So we have this challenge, and it's a challenge that I don't think Agile necessarily solves, right? This question of how do we actually know what is going to work with the customer. We can align with our product owner, but our product owner probably isn't our actual customer. And even if they are, I'm not sure about you, but sometimes we even see the project where we do exactly what the customer asks, and they still say, yeah, but that isn't quite what we really needed. So I think, unfortunately, when not done well, Agile sets up the product owner to fail, or it puts organizations in a dynamic where it becomes acrimonious between business and technology, where business isn't satisfied with what they're getting, but technology is kind of saying, but we're doing what you tell us, so it's not our fault. And no one's really happy with that. So here's how we do it. And I think this is kind of where what's called the build, measure, learn loop really fits. So kind of going back to these key principles of Lean Startup, Eric would say, that one of the most important things is, entrepreneurs are everywhere, and what they do is management. And this is where we get a little bit different than what a lot of people think. Yeah.
Brian, let's take a question or a comment, perhaps.
Oh, sure.
On the previous page where you talked about single ringable neck of product
yes.
owner. So the comment is, some teams can make this assumption that is, of course, not a good thing. But on the other hand, other teams can decide to do a demo at the end of the iteration, I guess, and not be limited by always assuming product owner to be the only source of feedback. Right?
I agree with you, although I think even there we still have the challenge of most software, most products that people build are not actually used in a conference room on a projector. So sometimes even there, yes, a demo is good feedback, but is that going to tell us that the product is really going to do what we want? And kind of one common example I'll see is if we do demos, but the demo is for a broad audience and it's kind of superficial, or it's to demonstrate the functionality, but it doesn't realistically show how the customers are going to use it. So one of my favorite examples of this was at one point working with a bank where they were building a web interface to replace all the back-end transactions, right? All the back-end old mainframe terminals whereby operations people would approve checks to clear, look for things for fraud, fix addresses, any of the millions of things that goes on in the back office of a bank, which is kind of tedious but has to get done for the bank to work. So they had this idea of building this beautiful web interface to replace all that. And they would do demos, and they would show each transaction, and they would show how beautiful the screens were, and everyone liked what it looked like, and they liked the experience. But what no one thought about was that once they deployed it to the field, once they deployed it to the floor where the operations people used it, the operations people were very different in the demo than they were on the floor. Because on the floor, they're paid per transaction. So they wanted a system that ran really, 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 really fast. And as most of you probably know, a web interface, even the fastest one, is not going to be as fast as a mainframe terminal. So basically, they looked at it in the demos and they said, yes, this looks beautiful, we like it, but they didn't really apply it to their context, which is, I get $1 for every transaction I do. If you slow me down 20%, you're forcing me to take a 20% pay cut. So they demoed it, everyone liked it, but when they actually deployed it, it was rejected almost immediately because the demo wasn't actually good enough feedback. So I guess that was a really long-winded answer to say, yes, I think demos are absolutely important, but we still have this risk. It's not necessarily good enough.
Right. That's good.
Great. Any other questions?
No, I think that's good. That was a key question.
Okay. All right. So we kind of come to this idea of the build, measure, learn loop. And the important thing about this over Agile, if you think about the Agile manifesto, right, where we say, we value, the primary measure of value is working product, or we value working product over, comprehensive documentation. Lean Startup says that learning is also valuable. That even if you don't have working product, if you have what they would call validated learning, that in its own right is valuable. And we can measure progress based on our ability to learn, or our ability to methodically identify, test, and validate our assumptions. And this is a little different than Agile, right? Because if we can answer those questions about what it is that we really want to build, that's progress for us. Now, another way that I would offer for you guys to think about something like this is the Cynefin framework, which is a sense-making framework for thinking about the nature of different problems. And David Snowden, who developed this, would categorize a problem falls within one of 4 domains. And we'll start in the lower right. There are, things that are simple. A simple thing is very predictable, is very repeatable. It's the area where we find best practices. It's an area where we, sense what's going on, categorize it into the best practice, and we then respond by doing that best practice. Simple stuff is probably all around you, and that's the stuff that we probably want to commoditize, or we might want to outsource. I feel like some good examples might be, if you're a company, your payroll for most companies is probably simple. You're going to outsource it to someone, and they're just going to do it as quickly and cheaply as they can. In no way does it really tie into what you offer or the core problems that you as a company solve or have to deal with. Moving up to the top right, we have what we call complicated problems. Complicated problems, still there is a domain of knowledge, which is very useful, right? There are still experts. You will notice that we say there are good practices and not best practices. A lot of parts of medicine or science, for example, might be in the complicated domain. We have practices or theories that are good, but they're not perfect. They're also not readily apparent to a layperson. So when solving complicated problems, we most likely want to analyze, we want to work with experts, and then we will respond. Now, if we move from the top right to the top left, is where we come to complex, or as in a complex adaptive system. And this is a system that is changing, a system which will respond to what you do, in which the act of even analyzing it very well may change it. One good example of, as you think about politics and polls, and if you've ever heard of the term of push polling, how people have found that even based on how you poll someone, how you ask a question is going to change how people view a topic or a politician. Complex problems are in that area. The act of even observing them may change them. Whatever you do to them, they're going to respond. And it's really not apparent, even if you are an expert, what that's going to look like, right? This is the area where we have to test hypotheses. This is the area where we need to kind of probe, and then based on what we see happen, respond. And then in the lower left, we have chaos. And chaos is an area of really no apparent order of any sort, where to a certain extent, even what we, even attempts to test against it don't work. It's just totally random. It's totally without any order or sense. It's not inherently bad. Sometimes we want to be in chaos, but it's very, very hard to plan in that area. I would argue that most organizations operate in the complicated. And sometimes things shift down to simple, but we do want to be careful, because if we treat a problem that is not simple as simple, really bad things happen. A good example of that would be mortgages, right? Where getting mortgages used to be a manual process done by an individual, done by a loan officer, right, at a bank. With the advent of more and more technology programs, it got automated, it got turned into something that could be done via forms, via formulas, packaged, done at a massive scale, and commoditized. People began to treat it simple. And as we saw with the housing bust, clearly that problem was not simple. And our treating it as such got us in serious trouble and almost kind of flipped into chaos. But most stuff states isn't complicated, or I would say complex, right? When we go to a new market, when we try to launch a new product, when we try to respond to competitors, that's all complex activity. So lean startup, and I think a real good innovative and discovery loop is kind of what this back and forth circle is here, where we start with our informed hypotheses. We work with our experts. We interview our users. We develop theories. We develop assumptions. And then we go and we push that into the complex domain by testing it, right? We go to market with things to experiment with. We do, and we'll talk about all sorts of different ways to get some of this feedback. But we test those hypotheses. And based on what we learn, we move back into complicated, because we'll learn more about that domain. And we go back and forth, whereby we build up subject matter expertise, and then we kind of continue to question it and test it. So this is kind of another way to think about this problem of what we're doing and how we deal with innovative things and how we deal with complexity. I would definitely encourage you, if you find this interesting, to go to the Cognitive Edge website, and there's some cool videos that explain this in much more depth. Having said that, before we go on, any questions, Armand?
Sorry, I've put myself on mute. No questions
Nope.
right now.
All right, great.
But
usually, and I can't.
Yeah, you may want to just repeat the website you mentioned for more information. You said Cognitive Edge website.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
And you can see Cognitive Edge is spelled in the bottom left.
Yeah,
and if you just Google Cognitive Edge, you will find it, or even Cynefin.
Yeah.
And you'll know someone knows about this, because if they call it Synfin, if they call it Cynefin, which is apparently the Welsh Welsh pronunciation, then they probably have been studying this for a bit.
Okay.
But anyway, neither here nor there. So I can't tell, because this is a webinar, but usually when this is a face-to-face, I usually at this point see some people, and their faces kind of saying something along the lines of, this is all great, I like these ideas, but I don't work for a startup, right? I work for a large organization. We can't afford to do experiments, or we don't sell directly to customers. So the idea of just putting out something out there and seeing if people buy it doesn't work, right? Maybe we work for an internal group. Our customers are forced to use our product because they're told to, because we're in the same company. Maybe we sell to businesses. Or also the idea of just getting something out there, I don't think we can do that very quickly. So what I want to talk about next is to walk through this build, measure, learn loop, kind of with an eye towards how do we make some of this stuff happen. So first, let's look at build. First of all, if you guys are doing agile, whatever flavor of agile, good. You probably need to do more. If you can't build in quick increments of work, releases on a regular basis, you're not going to be able to do this. I would think you need to be able to release bare minimum probably every 3 months. Ideally much, much faster. Some companies really do release all the time, and that's outstanding, but just kind of say you need to have really good agile engineering practices to do this. So agile absolutely helps, but it goes beyond that, right? Because we also have to make it safe to test, and there are risks and there are costs, right? Testing actually, there's energy required. If we run a test, if we put a product out, if we try a feature and people don't like it, we could damage our brand. If we misinterpret it, we actually could make the wrong decision. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then another one that's always difficult in large corporations is that sometimes failed tests are viewed as failure in general. Organizations, we frequently fall into what they call the a cognitive bias, or basically a confirmation bias, right? We're going to be programmed to look to prove what we think is right, and if we find disconcerting stuff, we're going to minimize it. And if we think about what we're really trying to do here, we're trying to apply the scientific method to our business problems, which means we have to be okay to fail our tests. So how do we get to an area that it's safe? One easy example is using sandboxes, production sandboxes. So one of the very first agile companies or projects I ever worked on, it was a big financial service website from a very prestigious financial service company that had zero tolerance for risk. They would not risk the brand. They would not risk their production website. So this made it very hard to release pretty much anything more than about once a year. So what we did is we built a sandbox. And what that sandbox was, it was production quality system with production quality software. And what we did is we'd use a router. And at first, what we did is we did internal sandbox demonstrations where all the employees of this financial service company would go to the sandbox and they would see the new features. And when something was then good, we could move it over to the big system. You know, later on, they started to beta it with select customers. So some customers, when they get to that router, they would go to the sandbox. Most would go to the current system. And now the company also had their protection. If anything ever was wrong with the sandbox, if they didn't like it, if it was a bad experience, they could immediately direct all the traffic back to their production system, thereby, you know, protecting their brand, protecting their system. This made it much safer for them to experiment because they could do it with a small subset of their population. Sometimes testing, it's more important to do psychologically. So here I have some examples. Delta, when Delta went to go into the low-cost airlines, they didn't just lower the price of Delta flights, they made song. Big Visible, actually, where, you know, I worked for 5.5 years. When we were first launching this tool called See Now Do, which was a visual task board, and a little bit beyond what we normally do, we didn't brand it as Big Visible. We branded it separately. In fact, actually, for a long time, we went to the See Now Do website. You'd really almost have to like read down into a legal disclaimer to realize it was Big Visible, because then if it kind of bombed, we didn't have to worry about it. Toyota is another example where they would launch new brands to pursue new markets or new areas. Scion is a particularly interesting one because they were trying to move, you know, away from their flagship brand to be something more configurable, something for younger people. Rather than move Toyota or Lexus, they made a new brand. And Google does this all the time. I mean, I think Gmail was in beta for I don't know how long, and now even they moved those new features to Google Labs. So sometimes that idea of a sandbox is psychological too. Another way that we can test is what I call Wizard of Oz testing. And for those of you who hopefully remember the Wizard of Oz, right, where Dorothy is sent to, you know, sent to the other side of the rainbow, and the wizard is to help her go back. And when she finally meets the wizard, she realizes that it's a man behind a curtain who's working this massive contraption to make it look like an all-powerful wizard is there running the city. We can do something similar with our products, whereby when we're first trying a service to a new customer in a very low scale, maybe we don't build any software. Maybe we just do that service manually. It will be expensive to us, but we haven't scaled up yet. We're just proving out the concept. We can do this very quickly, and human beings can be more adaptive than a system. So I think one of the examples Eric would talk about in his book, The LeanStart-Up, is Food on Your Plate, this website that would do custom shopping menus, whereby you would you know, say what you want for meals. They would plan out a bunch of meals and then give you the grocery list for that. For their first few customers, there was no software. They literally had kind of their meal planner just go to the customer's house and, you know, plan out the meals, give them the shopping list, and collect the $5 monthly check. Now, that customer knew they weren't going to get that personal treatment forever, and eventually it would be through a system, but they didn't want to build the system until they knew they had the process right. So this can become a powerful way for us to experiment with a service or a process before we even build any software or buy our product, or however as we go about implementing our system. We just use humans to fake it. So those are some of the ways that we build. Now we come to measure, and measure is tough because measurement is all about human perception and kind of human learning, and sometimes we like to fool ourselves, right? We have this idea of confirmation bias where we'll look to prove what we already believe, and we probably will devalue anything that tells us something otherwise. In fact, actually, this is where we kind of get to the concept of vanity metrics, where most of us would like to believe that we're pretty good at what we do and our ideas are pretty good. So we always have this risk when we build something that we're going to fall into what I call vanity metrics, or metrics that reinforce the belief that we're good, which means not all our metrics are really created equal. So I pose to you guys the question, and maybe actually I'll watch the chat right now so you guys can answer over the chat box. If we look at these 5 measures, my question to you is which of these 5 offers you the most value and insight into your product? A, 1 million unregistered unique visits. B, 500,000 people who viewed 2+ pages. C, 250,000 visitors who engaged with the website for 10 seconds or more. D, 20,000 users who registered and gave an email address. Or E, 1,000 members who paid money to be part of a subscription. Oh, and I guess actually I can't see the chat, so never mind. Hopefully, as you guys think about this, you're moving down to the bottom. And actually what you'll see is that progressively E is the most useful, followed by D, followed by C, and A is actually the least useful, because visits doesn't tell us that people actually want to buy our product. This is one of the problems that I think in the .com era got into. They became very infatuated with the big numbers, right? And if you remember, we'd have these websites, these .com businesses that would launch, like, we have this many million views or visitors. They're not buying stuff, or they're not buying enough stuff. People willing to buy your product is usually the best measure, which is one of the reasons you want to put features in front of customers as often as possible. Right. So here's a quick. Oh, yeah.
Answer that which sounds interesting. Someone gave. Most people actually agreed and gave the answer E, as you pointed out.
Good.
But another answer, of course, is someone gave is that it depends on the for different reasons. So I guess depending on what you're trying to validate in your market, you may have a different answer. I don't know what you think about that.
I think I would disagree, because my goal should ultimately be to build a product that people want. So if people won't buy it, nothing else matters. If I launch a big marketing campaign and I want to evaluate the value of that marketing campaign, and the marketing campaign brings in 5 million people, but they were the wrong people. They weren't the people who want to buy my product. That was a bad marketing campaign.
Makes sense.
So actually, no, I would disagree. I think pretty universally, people being willing to buy our product is our single best measure. Okay. Another way to look I say another way to look at it is Dave McClure has a lot to say about this, especially in the case of the B2C environment, where he talks about what he call the pirate metrics, because if you read the acronym, it would be R, like a pirate. And again, this is progressing. The lower down the list, the more important they are. Where acquisition, them coming to the site, or activation, them registering are the least important. Them referring people and them paying money are the most important. So let's just look at a little example that ties some of this together. I'm suspecting most of you are familiar with Amazon.com, and most of you have seen this little box I have highlighted in green. The frequently bought with this other, people who bought what you're buying also bought this. If you've ever taken Sales 101, you know that this box doesn't make sense. This box goes against one of the most fundamental messages of sales, which is that the moment a customer gives you a signal that they want to make a sale, you want to put as few things between them and completing the sale as humanly possible. This box is a distraction, right? I added something to my cart. I'm getting ready to check out. You're distracting me with more things. Sales 101 tells me that, no, I should just let you check out. A lot of the product management people at Amazon did not want to implement this feature. Development built it anyway because those developers, they do what they want sometimes. And Amazon happens to have a sandbox. They have a sandbox whereby they can route, I forget what it is, I want to say 5%, but I'm making that up, but some small amount of their traffic to a sandbox. So what they did was they decided to deploy this feature. They deployed this feature to their sandbox, and they sent a random distribution of their traffic to the sandbox, and they compared results. So they could see what the behaviors were for the people who didn't see this in real time to the people who did. And what they found was that the people who did see this bought 6% more when you measured the volume of a sale. That is why this is pretty much everywhere on every single page of Amazon.com. But I like it because it kind of, if we think back to that whole, complicated being about what the experts tell you and complex being about what the system tells you when you test it, the experts didn't want this feature. It was only by experimenting that they realized it was really valuable. And then that has since changed what the experts say about what makes a good sales process online. Now, sometimes there's the other challenge that people run into, which is I sell to businesses, or my customers are users who have to work with me, so I don't have a good way that I can measure whether or not they like my product because they have to use it. And this is where we could look at two different ways. Probably the less interesting one is user feedback, right? So things like the Net Promoter Score, where you ask, would you recommend other people use this? Or inviting users to journal, preferably in real time. One of the coolest tools you'll see with this is something like called UserStream, where it's just like a little tab that would show up on a website or a digital tool. At any point you're working, you can just give feedback wherever you are and categorize it however you'd like, and we can just see what people say as they use the tool, because when you ask them in the context of them doing their job, you get really interesting feedback, way better than if you put them in a conference room and do a focus group. The other way is that we can use metrics based on behaviors. So perhaps if we're an internal group, we want to look at things like, how do people use the application, or how do they adopt it? So one company I was working with was building a big online digital project management tool. All the project managers were required to use it. At first their thinking was, well, we can look at adoption, right? If people start to move their projects in, that will tell us that they like it, right? Now, that didn't quite hold up because everyone was ultimately mandated to go into the system. They were not only mandated to go into the system, but they were mandated to update it, I want to say once every 2 weeks. And ultimately, this helped them kind of figure out, well, there's other patterns we could look for. So for example, we can see how often a project's updated. It's an internal system, and these people have no presumption of privacy. We can see all sorts of data on how they use our internal system. So if people are required to update the system once every 2 weeks, then we know the person who, Friday at 3:30 goes into the system every other week and makes all their updates is a person who's not really using the system. It's a person who's simply doing the bare minimum that they're told. But someone who goes in every morning and updates the system, or someone who's in the system every day, all the time, that's a pattern that interests us. We want to interview those people. We want to talk to those people to understand why it is that they, what it is that they're getting that's valuable out of it, so we can maximize that. We might also want to talk to that person who only goes in Friday at 3:30, so we can understand why that's all they're doing. So even in a case where there's no sale, if we look at how they use the system, we can sometimes still gain some really interesting insight. It just comes down to figuring out, what does a good transaction look like in a situation like that. So we've built our system. We've come up with ways to measure it. Now we kind of come to this question of how do we learn, and what does that look like? And what I wanted to use to talk through this was another tool that I think is becoming very, very useful, which is the business model canvas. And this was developed by Alexander Osterwalder. I think he actually did his doctoral thesis on it. And then he just released it to the Creative Commons, and it just went viral. And the idea is that this kind of lays out a business case on one page. And it can be an excellent way to start to keep track of our assumptions, to start to think about what are the things that we have to learn about. Where do those assumptions come from that we want to build some tests about? So let me walk you through what this looks like ever so quickly. When we first use a canvas, the first thing we probably just do is we go through the checklist. We fill it out. So usually the place where we start is we start to talk about, okay, for our product or service, who are our customers? Who do we create value for? Understanding this is going to drive a lot of things. So who is the customer? Then once you know who the customer is, the next question is kind of what value are we going to be able to offer to this customer? What's the value proposition? So now we've identified the customer and the value prop. Then we want to talk about customer relationships and channels. So channels are going to be, how do we deliver that value to our customer? Is it through a website? Is it face-to-face? Do we do it in a store? Do we do it, is the channel through a corporate intranet because it's an internal user? Whatever the channel is, let's talk about what that channel is. Also, what's the nature of our relationship? Do we have long-term relationships with these people? Is it a transactional business? What does that relationship look like whereby we deliver value to our customer? Then as we start to think about the business case, well, what are the sales? What is the revenue that we can bring in? And when people do this for an internal project, sometimes revenue can be savings, right? Or revenue could be other, or prevention of loss, or things like that. It doesn't have to be more sales. When you're doing a product, it better be sales. But if you're doing an internal system, sometimes it's savings or other efficiencies. And then cost structure, how much will it cost to implement this? And again, we kind of crudely come up with something like that. And then we go on and we talk about, okay, so for the value proposition that we're going to deliver, what are the activities that we have to do, and who are the, and what are the resources, be they, people, plant, processes that we're going to need to do those activities. And ultimately, who are the partners who we're going to work with that will get us those those resources to do those activities. And altogether, this kind of lays out a high-level understanding of our business. So, the great way that we'll see people do this is they'll kind of make a canvas like this. They'll put it up on a wall and use stickies, and we just have a conversation about what this looks like. And an important piece of this is accessibility and conversation. If this were a face-to-face session, we'd have a little more time. I'd actually ask people just to do this as an example, and explain their canvas to the person next to them. Because what people find is they quickly start moving into, or realizing that there are a lot of assumptions, right? There's a lot of hypotheses. There's a lot of, well, I think that I sell this to single mothers who don't have enough time, but I'm not sure. Or I'm pretty sure that this will be their value proposition, but how do I know? So as we start to talk through those leaps of faith, now we come to this question of really understanding what are the riskiest assumptions that we have that we need to get answered. And generally speaking, the single most risky assumption is your customer. If you don't know who your customer is, not much else matters. One of my favorite examples about this is, they use the canvas but nicely demonstrates the value of knowing your customer, Bloomberg terminals. Bloomberg was very astute in understanding their customer when they first launched the terminals, because they understood that their customer wasn't some IT procurement group. Their customer was a trader on a stock floor, on a trading floor, and that these people had a huge amount of power and influence in the companies. If they wanted a given terminal, they were going to get that terminal because they made that much money for the company. They also knew these people were very, very busy. So Bloomberg was actually the first to put all sorts of things that they thought would interest a broker but might not be mission critical to the business of a trading floor, on the thought that brokers are busy. So if I'm a broker and I can get the weather, I can get sports, I can get the scores of recent sport events. If I can see news headlines or other things that might interest me, great. I'm really busy. I can now get that while I'm working. I'm going to want that terminal. And that's exactly what happened. Traders wanted the Bloomberg terminals, and that's kind of one of the reasons that Bloomberg came to dominate the market, because they knew their customer. Our second most risky assumption is most likely in the value proposition. Because even in this case of Bloomberg, we heard there was a big assumption that traders wanted this convenience. They didn't know it until, obviously, the traders bought it. That's our next one. And we could keep going. The only other one I would throw out is, not that we have to be incredibly precise, but the revenue, the benefit of a project or a business venture, or kind of whatever it is we're mapping out here, should easily outweigh the cost. If it's close, it's probably not a good idea. It's definitely not a breakthrough, innovative idea. If a 5% shift is going to destroy this, it's probably not worth it. Now, we could keep going, but I'd say those are the key ones that we'd really want to look at. So as we walk through the canvas, what we start to get is we start to figure out what are the biggest assumptions. And usually we'll see something kind of like this. So we start out with our business canvas. We start to identify what this whole thing is going to look like. And one of the big assumptions we're saying is our users, right? So we probably start to develop personas or empathy maps, which are some other great tools to better understand them. And ultimately then, based on the biggest assumptions, we're going to start to lay out our experience map, or a kind of a story map that will probably help us challenge those assumptions, and then that feeds into our backlog that we operate and deliver kind of in the agile fashion, the way that we do all our work. It might look a little bit different than some people think about with a traditional agile project, if you'll pardon the pun. Because a lot of times in agile projects, we say we always do the most valuable thing first. And if you remember when we were talking about one of the ways that Lean Startup's a little different is that we value learning. So if you look at this chart where kind of the horizontal axis represents time and the vertical axis represents, let's just call it business value or delivery of valuable features. At first, we probably don't prioritize based on value. We prioritize based on learning or risk, right? And so you're going to notice that some of the features that come out first may not apparently be the most valuable because there were certain assumptions that we had to prove out first. Hopefully at some point the big risk is cleared and then we maximize on value. And then ultimately probably at some point in the project we start to get the most valuable stuff and the marginal value of the next feature is dropping and dropping and we got to watch out for gold plating. We probably want to go back and figure out what our next big idea is and not do kind of those last 3 green arrows because chances are the marginal value of that is not all that great. So let's talk about one small thing you can do tomorrow. Actually, I'll give you 2. One would be if you go online and you kind of Google business model canvas, you can easily find a template like this. There are a number of YouTube videos as well that will walk you through it, but even the explanations are kind of fairly straightforward. Print out a canvas or put it up on your dry erase board or however it is that you work and lay it out with stickies. Fill in each thing. Easiest way would be start on the right, work to the left, and do it and explain it to someone. And as you explain it to someone, think about where those big assumptions are. Because chances are, however you work, you're going to want to confront those assumptions. Well, one more thing. If you are using something like a Kanban board, or even actually pretty much any task board, most boards end on go to production. Or that's where we have done is, did we implement it? Did we build it? Add one more column. And let's call that column validate. So when you finish a feature or a story or a capability, come up with a way to test it. And this actually might go exactly to what that one question was about earlier on, where, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm about to sneeze. Okay, sorry. Where we might try to validate our features in a demo, which is an excellent idea. But maybe that's not enough. Excuse me. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe we want to do a beta test. Maybe we want to do some of that Wizard of Oz testing with a feature. Maybe we want to get it to a sandbox. Whatever the case may be, let's conspire to design our board, to design our flow, so that we don't call a story or a feature or request done until not only have we built it, but we've learned something from it. We validated that indeed that's what we wanted.
So,
and
Brian,
look at my watch. Oh, sure.
One question on the previous page of when you were talking about it was someone asked, and I'm not familiar with myself with this topic. I've heard the term though. How does this compare the business canvas with the lean canvas notion?
Yes. Yes. Ash Mayura, who is advocating for what he calls the lean canvas. I think the quick comparison and contrast is that the business model canvas is more focused on a business model. The lean canvas is more focused on a single product. If you like the lean canvas, it works just as well. If the lean canvas fits what you're doing or it kind of groks for you better, use the lean canvas. I think it's actually a great one. The business model canvas, I think, is perhaps a little bit bigger picture. And when you start talking about an established company, I think sometimes it applies a little bit better. But by all means, I think either one works, and there's just a little bit of a judgment call.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
You got it. Well, actually, I was going to say that was the end. So I mean, I still would encourage you guys. I'm pretty sure we'll have this out on the Big Visible website, and there's an email address if you want to learn more. But I think we do have some time, so I would be happy to field questions for the
yeah. So there are a few questions, and I would encourage the audience to reflect on the content we just went over. And if you have any other questions, I have a few in the backlog already. Then please post them on the Q&A panel here. And while you're doing that, let me take just a couple of minutes, if at that, and introduce Synerzip to you, those who are new to us. So Brian, if you don't mind just advancing the page one.
Oh, look at that. Yeah, sure. No problem.
I'll quickly, and the one after that shows the Synerzip, the 5 points about Synerzip. So essentially, Synerzip is a software product development partner. We focus on working with small to mid-sized, typically innovative technology companies. And Brian, if you can advance one slide forward, that will bring up the few points about Synerzip and just build it out with a few tips so we would speed it up. So for every client, we are a development partner. For every client, we put together a team, dedicated team, and an emphasis is actually on team of software professionals that can work collaboratively with our clients and help them deliver working software following agile techniques. We have a development center in India and a small team on the US side. And with the combination, we are able to provide a significant, typically 50% cost advantage, and also, in addition, provide a flexibility that our clients can, whenever ready, they can convert the team that is working for them into their own captive operation, often known as a BOT, build, operate, transfer kind of arrangement. That's about Synerzip. Next page, Brian, if you don't mind flipping one more time, gives a snapshot of some of our clients. This is not exhaustive list, but gives you an idea of most of the kind of work we do. And with that, let's start taking some questions. So the first question, Brian, I would like to take is this notion of defining how to select the safe sandbox to do this lean startup cycle with them. So you talked about that you gave an example of Amazon and how they take 5% or some small section. So how do they? How is it different 5% every time in the case of Amazon, and it kind of makes sense? How do they apply, or would the company apply it in a B2B environment if they're selling to a class of customers and the numbers are not huge? If you have 20 customers, 100 customers,
In the B2B market, I think it looks a lot like early adopters and strategic partnerships, right? So it might be more like reaching out quietly or publicly, perhaps, to a couple companies and saying, this is the next feature that we want to deliver. Will you do it with us, or will you adopt it as we build it? And maybe there's some benefit where they get better pricing, or that they get more of a say in what it looks like, or there's nice press that you guys can talk about it as a partnership. I think it probably looks more like that in a lot of times when you're doing big B2B relationships. One company that I work with literally would demo every 2 weeks. As they built a feature, they would basically kind of pick one customer that they would work with, and their demo every 2 weeks, they were doing Scrum, would include people from that company watching the demo and talking about what they like, what they don't like.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Let's take another question, which is this constant tension that is there in many companies where bringing a partial product quickly in front of even a subset of customers runs the risk of turning off customers or the concern that it may turn off a class of customers and they will never come back. So companies tend to keep trying to build it out till they feel it is good enough to introduce, and sometimes that's too long. So do you have any advice on balancing this concern for half-baked introduction of the product to get quick market feedback, yet turning off?
I want to say that this is from the guys at 37 Signals who build like Basecamp and some of the other productivity tools, but don't hold me to that because I forget. I'm pretty sure this is a quote from them, but they'll talk about launching a new product, and what they'll actually say is, if you're not ashamed of your first release, you waited too long. And I know that fear is out there, but I think you have to weigh it against the cost that if you don't release anything, there is a 100% chance that nobody will think anything of you. So my experience, I've never seen a bad feature destroy a website, in one fell swoop. I mean, heck, healthcare.org is even still out there. I know that fear is there. I've never seen it happen. A lot of people talk about it. My experience has been that the market, chances are when you launch, the bigger risk is no one's going to even notice, rather than it's going to be such an awful experience that they'll never come back. If you've got the right value, they will come, whether they like to or not.
Okay. All right, let's take then the related question, which is to encourage people in larger companies, enterprise context to push themselves to do that and introduce the product early in the market and that risk. How do you make it safe to fail in an organization? What do you do as a or what can you recommend in these contexts that we would encourage our people to make these experiments?
I think sometimes it's just giving people a good analogy, right? So I think one of the most important analogies is like, well, so if you think about it, especially in software, which is my background, for whatever reason, the analogy that everyone always goes to, or at least people who kind of orbit the industry but maybe not quite are in it, is building a house, which is a terrible analogy on so many levels. But in the analogy of building a house, a mistake, being wrong about something has hugely profound consequences, and not in a good way. I think a better analogy is basically the scientific method, an exploratory lab, where most of our experiments will fail, and that's entirely okay. In fact, if none of our experiments failed, chances are we're not actually learning anything. If we have an analogy like that, it helps. It helps a lot. Because now we can make sense of it. Another thing that can sometimes help is we can codify this stuff in our bureaucracy. So one thing, actually, I think this is what David Stone will do in dealing with complex environments in these large organizations, is they'll build a process and they'll build a standard template for experiments, or for planning your experiments, and there'll be the template for the experiment I expect to fail and the experiment I expect to pass. And you have to define so many experiments that you expect to fail. You have to, require to. So, now if things are failing, it's part of the bureaucracy. It's part of what the system is asking you to do. It makes it a little safer. But I think it's a big challenge. And I think it really comes down to the mental model of how we think about work.
Right. No, that makes sense. Okay, we have time for at least one more question, and we'll see how we do on time. We've got 3 more minutes. So the next question is, you talked about shrinking releases to 3 months or so. So what are some ways to get the customers to think smaller so you can actually do release in short time frame? Any suggestions?
Maybe don't ask your customers. And well, no, because I think what happens very early on is they say, I want these 10 things, and I don't want any less than these 10 things. So if you don't give me these 10 things, don't bother giving me anything. And then we lay out a project plan, or we plan up to build all 10 things, and it's going to take 18 months, which becomes 24 months, and all of a sudden, like, we're 2 years in, and it's delayed, and now what do we do? So I think you have to always build as if you can release. And maybe what you do is you say to your customer, every 3 months, or I feel I even want more, but every 3 months we're going to put out a release. You always have the right not to take it, but it's going to be there, right? Eventually they'll get the picture, and as they want new features and new support,